Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lioness at the Door podcast. I'm Jackie Sorensen. I am a wife and a mother and a grandmother and a holistic health coach for women of faith. And I have great joy in all of those things. And I am so excited to have with me here today my friend, David Monson. And I have a lot to say about David and about what he does, but I'll let him speak for himself. But I just want to give you a little introduction. I knew David when we were in college, and that was a nice association. My husband and I met in a singing group, and David was part of that. And so those were good memories. But now connecting with him again after 37 years or so, right?
Long time.
I have come to appreciate and admire David on a whole new level at this point in our lives. He is the father of 3 girls and 2 boys. And he comes to what he's doing now, which we'll tell you about, but he comes to that after 20 plus years of experience in leadership development, team development, course development. And you'll hear why all of those things have prepared him to do what he's doing now that I'm so excited to share. So about a year ago, David contacted me because he knew that my husband and I have a child on the autism spectrum. And at the time, it was just, hey, this is what I'm doing. And I said, hey, this is what I'm doing. And it sounded to me like we were really doing things that kind of dovetail with each other. Very, very similar principles that we teach, and mostly our desire to help families, to help moms and dads, and ultimately to help kids is very similar. And I'm really honored to just to be kind of on the same page with David. So a year ago, I became aware that he had a program that helped parents with kids on the spectrum. And then sometime after that, our lives changed again because our son had been home. Then he had been at a group program for 6 years, and then he had been home again for 4 years. And then he had been in another group home for a year and a half. And then he was home again. And so we become empty nesters, and then not, and then empty nesters. And then we've been doing this dance for his adult life. And what we found this time was that we had learned a great deal about our relationship with him and how we wanted that relationship to grow and to change, and how it needed to change. But this time, when he came home, I knew that we needed someone that could see us from a distance, someone that could look from the outside in and give us some support. So I was praying. How can we do this? What can happen? And boom, there was David's name flopped into my mind. And in about 5 minutes, I had contacted him, purchased his coaching program, and we were off. And I am so grateful that we did that. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that. David, anything else you want to add to this intro part?
No, I think you've done a fantastic job. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I have a few questions that I thought would give our audience a pretty good idea of what you do, why you do it, and what the benefits are. So first of all, why do you have this great desire to work with parents who have children on the autism spectrum, and what prepared you to do that?
Now, that's a great question, Jackie. And I think I'll probably break this into two parts. So let me just tackle the first one of why did I choose to work with parents? And I think that it's a great question because, so many, we're so used to, well, okay, my kid's got all these issues. I'm just going to send him off to the therapist and meet with him once a week and,
Right.
progress can make, right? What we have found is that when working with parents, they will have a greater impact on that with that child on the spectrum than almost anything else we can do. I mean, if you think about it, working with a therapist, they're going to stay in maybe 1 hour a week with that child in trying to make a difference in their lives. But that parent is with them each and every day, several hours a day.
Right.
And more than teachers, more than therapists, more than anyone, that parent is going to by far have the biggest impact. Now, the second thing to that is that parents, as we've learned through psychology, you don't have a fully matured brain until you're at least 25. So these kids are still developing their brains. Parents have now hopefully not only have a fully developed brain, but they've learned some really critical coping mechanisms to overcome what we call going into the shielding system, and I'll define that. The shielding system is really an autonomic response to a perceived threat of going into fight, flight, or freeze. And we've all had those experiences. Kids on the spectrum are far more susceptible, shall we say, to doing that than a lot of people. So working with the kids, it's really hard if they perceive anything in their environment that is emotionally unsafe, they're not going to come out of that survival mode. So if we can work with the parents who now hopefully have these coping mechanisms that they're not going into their shielding system themselves, at least not as often, to learn and to teach them how to create these environments of peace, of emotional safety, we have had great success in then helping these kids to come out of that environment of their shielding system, where they can finally begin to grow and to thrive. Because, just to give you an example, if you're running away from a bear, you're not really thinking about, gosh, I wonder what I could do to improve my life today. It's not going to enter even the remote part of your brain. And that's the way these kids are on the shielding system, is if they're in their shielding system, most, if not all of the time, anything you're trying to teach them, how to socially develop, how to, learn, all of these things are going to go right out the window.
Right.
Great analogy that I use is, if you can almost consider the soldier in the middle of a battlefield, muddy boots, hovering between life and death, and all of a sudden his little old grandma comes up and says, "Today's the day. I want to teach you how to knit." I mean, sorry, grandma might be a wonderful person, and I'm sure she's got the best of intentions, but this isn't the time, this isn't the place, right?
Right.
What we need to do is help these kids come off of that battlefield, find that environment of safety, and then we can finally teach them all of the skills that they have been finding.
So profound. Yes.
So now your second question, you asked me what prepared me for this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wise mentor that I was working with once upon a time had a great little couplet that I love to use. He said, "Your mess is your message." And actually I had two boys on the spectrum, but I primarily raised my one son, Travis. And let me tell you, when I was raising him, I definitely had a mess. He was diagnosed at 7 with ADHD, mostly I think because the schools really try to push that, right? They want to mitigate these kids so that they're not disrupting the classrooms. So it wasn't until he was 11, he was finally diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum, as well as having ODD, oppositional defiance disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as he got older, that defiance got worse, and he got more and more defiant. And he was even harder and harder to handle. And got to the point where we were having daily arguments. You know, by arguments, I mean a window gets broken, a
Oh,
cop gets called, a knife gets pulled, either on me or on somebody else, or something else happens to escalate it almost to the breaking point of either destroying property or physical safety or something else. And with all of that, I will readily admit, you know, as a parent, we made a lot of mistakes, a lot of things I wish I would have learned back then. You know, we were talking before where you said, you know, I wish I could have known these things. I do too, because so much of what we now understand was not available back
right.
then. But we did the absolute best we could. And with the principles that I learned and all the research that I gained, I think we actually did a lot of things right. And this is why I feel that way. Just fast forward about 10 years from then, Travis went from flunking out of school, actually didn't even graduate high school. He had to take night classes to get his high school degree.
Mm-hmm.
Just last year, graduating with a 4.0 GPA in college. He went from being very socially awkward to now being happily married to a beautiful wife that absolutely adores him. He's a partner, a full partner in a thriving online business and living, as he calls it, my dream job. Okay, so then it kind of begs the question, well, how did we get from the Travis then to the Travis now?
Right.
And, you know, as we went through this, a lot of the things that I researched, and I think even a lot of things I felt directed to, I learned some core principles and skills that really helped to turn not only my life, but also his life around and made this huge difference. And that is exactly why I've decided that I want to now dedicate my life into passing those same principles on and helping others.
Mm. That's incredible. I agree. I think the things that we go through, we use that phrase a lot.
Yes.
We went through this really difficult time. That's really our education, isn't it?
It is.
And I can relate to that. I think I could just say ditto. That's how Lioness at the Door was born as well, for moms who could use support in taking care of themselves and learning how to care for their families. So that's amazing. I'm grateful for the education that you received during those years, because it's been a blessing to me. So how then did Spectrum Advice, your company, come into being?
Okay. Well, I want to go back. When you introduced yourself, you know, you said that you are helping women of faith. I love that. And because you're coming from that perspective, let me tell my story from that perspective.
Okay, great.
Okay. So while I was raising Travis and even afterward, I felt very guided and directed in the things that I needed to learn and what I even needed to become to be able to help him become what he needed. But it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I felt very driven to join this particular program that I had heard about and was actually very drawn to. Now, up until that point, you know, this wasn't the start of my self-improvement journey, right?
Yeah.
I had taken several other things, and I honestly thought I was in a pretty good place. I thought that I had really resolved a lot of things in my emotional life and other things. And what I realized going through this program is that I had a lot of work left. I worked on myself probably more than I had ever before.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did I really work hard on myself, but I worked on all the relationships in my family. My wife, not only Travis, but the rest of my 4 children. And I think as a result of those efforts, I experienced some great, fantastic miracles in my life. But it was when I was nearing the end of that program, after having seen all of these great miracles and these great things happen, that this idea of spectrum advice came. And not only the idea, but with it came this vision of exactly what I needed to accomplish. And I was totally blown away, but I know, and I even thought for a long time, and I pondered, why now? Why
Yeah.
I done this 20 years ago?
Right.
Whatever.
Right.
I am convinced spectrum advice would not have come into being if I had not first walked the talk of physician, heal thyself.
Right.
And because I was able to make those changes, that hopefully now I can be an instrument in helping other people make those same changes and experience those same great miracles that I.
Right. And I appreciate that you were in the mode of not just growing yourself, but you were also in a place of asking for that personal revelation of, what do I do with this? What do I do next? What's the next step for me? And I love that Heavenly Father showed that to you and
Yes.
gave you that vision. And then also how, the how, which is also a really big question. So that's incredible. And I think that's something that we are all in Lioness working on, is that vision and our mission.
Yes.
And what God wants us to do.
I've learned since then that not only did you get the vision at the beginning, but as you go, that vision became more clear, and I felt very directed every step of the way in turning that vision into reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And I'm sure that means that there have been a million baby steps.
Yes.
In between that first inkling and then the actual coming to fruition that has happened.
Absolutely.
So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So did that cover how did the spectrum advice come into being, or was there more you wanted to say?
Unless you have additional questions.
No, I think that's good. I will say that along with having the experience of being a father to two sons on the spectrum, that also your professional life, your leadership development, team development, course development has been such a big player. I've told David that I wish I had that in my back pocket. His programs are just fleshed out and beautiful and laid out step by step and just so thorough and so well done, so easy to follow. That professional life that you've lived has really prepared you also for doing what you're doing.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because not only the experience of raising not one, but two boys on the spectrum, not just the mistakes we made, but everything we learned through that process, and then professionally. It's interesting. And there's a quote that I often think of a religious leader that once said, when you get to the end of your life, you'll be absolutely amazed at how much the Lord has micromanaged your life without taking away your free agency.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly didn't know it then. I just got, I had two boys on the spectrum. Great, wonderful.
Yeah.
And this just happened to be my chosen profession. And it wasn't until this vision came together that all of those puzzle pieces lined up. And I'm like, oh, this is why.
Yeah. There's no happen to be about it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's incredible. So what would you say? And I have a really good idea about what this answer might be, because I've just been the recipient of it. Well, actually, before I ask you this question, I want to say just a little bit about our experience going through a spectrum advice program. We did the Masters of Motivation program, and it was a 10-week course where we met with David once a week. We had materials that and very clearly written out assignments, exercises, journaling, self-care, all kinds of things that we did each week in between class. And it was really a wonderful revelatory journey. And as I started into it, I was a little bit, I wasn't conflicted in that I felt like it was an answer to my prayer. And I try not to argue with those. I mean, I have, but I try not to. And so I felt like it was dropped into our laps at the right time. But the conflict, the little bit of conflict that I had was, I teach these things too, right? I've been learning these things, very similar journey, created a company, work with people. This is my joy to be in these principles, to teach them and share them, and to do my best to live them every day. So I kind of felt like, well, is this a little bit redundant? You know, do I need someone to walk me through this? Maybe this is stuff that I already know. But that was not a thing at all, because while we teach very similar principles, and maybe even exactly the same principles, David's way of presenting it and walking you through it, and the baby steps, the way that he has lined it out, the way that he's been inspired to line it out for people, this specific demographic of parents with kids on the spectrum, is different from how I've lined mine out for women of faith in families. Same principles, different end, and different words and different examples and different videos and different, anyway, it was just really enlightening to learn again, to go through the process again of hearing these principles in a new way, in a different way, and seeing an application to them in a different way. So there wasn't any moment of, well, I already knew this, so this was kind of a waste. It didn't feel like that at all, ever. And I was just telling David before we came on this call that if I had been able to hear a conversation like this, or to have his coaching program 20 years ago, how different our lives would have been. So both my heart and my hope, and I think I can speak for both of us, is that we want to reach back and help someone that's coming up behind us, some parent that's struggling. And that is a really burning, deep desire. And that desire comes to you in part because of the level of difficulty that we have both experienced in our family life. We know how it is to be there, and we know how distressing it can be at times, and how you feel like you're living on a planet all by yourself, because your other kids' friends don't have any idea what you're talking about. They don't know what you're living. They don't know what the challenge is. I mean, not that anyone wasn't trying. It's just that it is a different life to be raising a child on the spectrum. So for any of you who are raising a child on the spectrum, or if your sister is, or if your friend next door is, I hope that you would share this podcast with them. And I hope that you would share Spectrum Advice and David's company and programs with them, because it would be, it could change the trajectory of their family. So what one thing would you say, David, to a mom or a dad who have a child on the spectrum and they're struggling, they're in the middle of it, they're in that trench of those middle years where They're just trying to figure out how to get that child to school, how to get them to eat, how to get them to get along with their siblings, how to get them to get dressed in the morning, to take a bath, I mean, it's a really, really intense struggle. What's the one thing that you would say?
First, before I get into that question, I wanted to thank you for that, sharing your experience. I mean, that is awesome. I actually felt just as intimidated, thinking, okay, Jackie knows all of this stuff. Is there anything I can teach her? But I am so glad that you were able to gain the things that you feel like you've gained. But to your question, these parents that are just in the trenches, slogging it out day after day, struggling, as I know you did, as I know I did,
Mm-hmm.
to try to find these answers. First, I want to say there's hope. A lot more hope than I think you and I have, because the resources are here.
Yep.
And so many more things, but my hat goes off. You've been hanging in there. You've been doing the absolute best that you can, slogging it out every day. And you really need to be commended. Second thing, it's probably the most defining thing that really changed my whole perspective on not only my son on the spectrum or sons, but my parenting style and what I needed to do. And it was interesting, I know in our conversation yesterday, you brought up the very same point as the biggest impact that you received from this. And it is basically this, that when my son Travis was struggling with meltdown, with arguments, pulling himself up in his room for hours on end, and all of the other things that we talked about, the destruction of property and all of those things that we went through, all of those things came down to one single defining factor, that this wasn't motivation issue.
Oh, could you wait? Could you say that again? This is really, really, really important.
But all of those things that your kids are struggling with, all of their behavior issues, all of their defiance or escaping, pulling themselves up, it is not a motivation issue. Okay, all that time I thought, Travis chose to be incorrigible. He chose to be rebellious. He chose to not listen. He chose to not mind. And when I finally understood that all of it was an involuntary reaction that he could not control, to put him into the survival mode, into his shielding system, fight, flight, or freeze, changed everything. Now we knew the root of the problem. Now we could finally begin to address the root of the problem. When I learned the skills of what I needed to do as a parent, of what I needed to help Travis to do, to come out of his shielding system, to stay out of his shielding system, as we already mentioned, so that you could finally begin to grow, to learn, to develop, to come off that battlefield and finally feel safe. It changed everything. It changed my life, it changed his life. And that is exactly why I am so passionate about doing anything and everything like that, to help parents learn those same principles so that their kids can finally come out of their survival mode and truly.
We lost just the last couple of words. They can come out of their survival mode and
truly begin to thrive.
to thrive. Yes. Yes. So this is really interesting because the shielding system, as you describe it, is something that we talk about in Lioness a lot for moms.
Really.
That is, are you in your parasympathetic nervous system response or your sympathetic nervous system response? Same thing,
It
same
is the same.
idea, same phenomenon, different words, right?
Right.
When a mom is in her sympathetic nervous system or in her fight or flight, not thinking, just responding, just reacting, things don't go very well.
Right.
So practicing taking ourselves out of that response and moving over into the parasympathetic response where you can rest and digest, where you can think, where you can have a conversation, where you can act on purpose, not out of a response. That's where we want to be as parents. But the way that David describes this as for a child, having that shielding system is it's such a great way to say it, because you can see the child's using their energy to defend themselves, right? There, all of a sudden, there's a reason to be fearful, to be in that fear state. And when we feel afraid, just like moms, when we're in our sympathetic nervous system, we're not thinking, we're not learning, we're not digesting our food, our reproduction doesn't work, all those things are just shut down and in wait mode. It's the same thing for kids. But the piece that David points out so well is for a child on the spectrum, because of the sensory issues, the communication issues, and those things, from a parent's perspective, it just seems like, well, the kid's just being difficult. Well, I know that these sensory issues exist, but what does the sensory issue have to do with actually you just get up out of bed and you just put your clothes on, you know? So you explained so beautifully how the nervous system and the sensory issues and the communication issue, how that all works together, but not so that you can understand why your child's not doing what they're doing, or not doing what they're supposed to do, or that they're acting so defiantly, or that they're so frustrated or whatever. It actually gives you something to do as a parent. There's something that we can do. So often when we're talking diagnosis, we're just talking, well, this is how it is. This is how this child rolls. When in actuality, no, that's not correct. Yes, there are some deficits, or there are some different ways that they're perceiving the world, but it does not explain the defiance and the frustration and the anger. That part is the part that we can change. I think that's the most empowering thing of all.
And unfortunately, the most of the psychological community on the spectrum, they look, because the DSM is very driven, by the way, for those who don't know, the DSM is all the official psychological diagnoses, right? How they define them. That entire definition is built on outward behaviors. So therefore, most therapists are trained to deal only with those outward behaviors. You have to drop below the tip of the iceberg and begin to see what is happening in that huge iceberg that's underneath.
Right.
To truly finally get to understand where these kids are coming from.
Right.
And if you can help them, as you said, to come out of that sympathetic nervous system, out of their shielding system, finally they can begin to learn social skills. They can begin to move ahead in their education. They can begin to learn coping skills to deal with their sensory issues, because they finally have the emotional bandwidth and the learning capabilities now to do all of that.
Yeah. And they have their parents back.
Yes. And you talked about parents going into that, into their shielding system, or into the sympathetic.
Yeah. When
you do that, you're not going to think about all these great parenting techniques.
No.
Or, this parenting class that you went to.
Right.
You're going to go back to what you learned when you were 3
Right.
or 4 or 7, right? For good, for bad, or ugly. And that is one of the reasons why, as you know, part of that program that you went through, we spend a great deal of time not just teaching these parenting techniques, but helping these parents to learn how to stay out of the shielding system themselves.
Yes. Yes.
So that they can truly master and employ these principles.
Right.
That have them up here, but to be living them.
Right. And that's something that we have in common. It's what we do is not just teaching.
Yes.
But I have found from experience that it's walking beside, giving feedback, asking questions, being extremely empathetic. And that helps a person move forward. So, well, it has been my pleasure to have you here to share what you do with our listeners. I can't recommend David Monson and Spectrum Advice highly enough. I have full 100% confidence that if you are willing to be guided, to learn, to look at yourself, to unpack some baggage, to learn new ways of seeing your child, I am confident that things will change for the better for you as a parent and for not just your child on the spectrum, but for your entire family. So thank you very, very much.
And, you know, since you brought up my program, maybe I'll just extend this, that any of your listeners, if they are interested in looking at these things, because, you know, of how much I have appreciated both you as well as your husband and going through the program and everything else, if they can go to Spectrum Advice or even send me an email at help@spectrumadvice.com and just put Lioness. I will give them, for anyone who's interested, almost a 50% off discount to go through
Yes.
because I want to help your people just as much as I possibly can.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
So help@spectrumadvice.com. If you
Yes.
need this kind of support, don't wait for this afternoon. Don't wait an hour. Just jump on, talk to David, get on his queue and get going. Thank you very much for that offer. I appreciate it. So all of you that are listening, I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you'll share this with your family and friends. Please let anyone that you know who has a child on the spectrum know that there is help available, that there is hope, that there's someone that is available to walk beside them and to learn and grow into a new way of doing this kind of parenting. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate you.
Okay, Jackie.
Okay, take care.
All right, see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.